Today, we're going to be joined by two experienced communicators who are going to be sharing tips on crafting compelling narratives out of your campaigns to shut down incinerators and build environmentally just zero waste solutions. So we are joined by GAIA's own Zoë Beery, who has joined us as our US-Canada communications coordinator. Previously, she worked for 7 years as a freelance journalist and editor for publications including The Village Voice, BuzzFeed, and the New York Times. We'll also be joined by Shilpi Chhotray. She is a plastic pollution activist grounded in the principles of social justice and systems change. She uses storytelling and organizing as her tools. She served as a trusted advisor to journalists at publications like NPR, Rolling Stone, and the BBC on the plastic pollution crisis, and built the Break Free from Plastic movement's communications arm from the ground up to amplify the work of grassroots leaders around the world and undermine plastic and oil industry status quo. Shilpi actually just launched People Over Plastic, an exciting new podcast that is dedicated to shedding a light on the intersectional nature of the fight for climate justice. So we're super excited to have them both joining us today. I think we were going to have Shilpi go first, but she's having some problems joining because of the Zoom problem. So we're going to rearrange things a little bit and have Zoë go first and tell us a little bit about how to craft compelling narratives specifically for a media audience and amplifying your campaign through the media and attracting that sort of attention. So yeah, take it away, Zoë, and feel free to share your screen.
Yeah, thanks so much, Adi. I really appreciate the introduction, and thanks everyone for joining. I'm really excited to be bringing my experience as a journalist to the zero waste movement, which has so many amazing stories that I think publications would be very lucky to have. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen for just 1 second. Oh, hold on. I'm now having, there we go. Whoops, sorry. I'm having just a few issues. There we go. Oh, sorry, I actually have to leave the meeting for a second and come right back.
Hey folks, Zoë just let me know that her Zoom was crashing, unfortunately. So she is exiting and joining us again, and we'll be back shortly. Again, thanks for bearing with us as we deal with all this tech stuff. Oh, there she is.
Hi, everyone. Okay, let's try this again. So I'm just going to share my screen really quickly. Great. And go into this. Okay, so when it comes to dealing with a media audience, there are a couple of particular things to keep in mind. I want to just go over quickly what we're going to be talking about today. The first thing is what press and organizers want from each other. It's a, you could say, mutually beneficial relationship, but there are sometimes conflicting priorities. So we're just going to go over a little bit of that. Then the reporting process, I think them from the perspective of organizers, this can be a little bit opaque sometimes, and understanding how journalists do their job can be really helpful in terms of setting your own expectations, and then also helping them do their job in a way that's the most beneficial to you and your campaign. We're going to talk a little bit about newsworthiness, which is what determines whether and how your campaign gets covered. Again, I think this is something that can be maybe not opaque, but a little bit unfamiliar to organizers. And so helping understand what qualifies as like a great story to a journalist is going to help you get your campaign in the press and shape how it's covered when you are in contact with journalists. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about best practices with dealing with media from the perspective of zero waste organizing. So what does the press want from you? Most of all, they want stories. They want things that they're excited to write about, that their editors are excited to publish. And when we're looking at what kinds of stories journalists are looking for, there's a couple of different things. So they'll want to humanize an issue, right? Like with something like climate or even zero waste and waste management, these topics can either be kind of overwhelming to audiences or unfamiliar. And so having a story that really humanizes the issue is very appealing. Or maybe it's a new take on a familiar issue. That's something that can also be very appealing to media audiences when they have a little bit of fatigue about a topic. Finding a new angle, which the zero waste movement is full of, can be really helpful in kind of selling your story to a reporter. And then if you have a previously unreported update, which a journalist refers to as a scoop, that can be really helpful, especially in establishing relationships with journalists. If you set yourself as somebody who has kind of like inside knowledge about what's going on, that can make them more excited to kind of come to you when they have a story. They also want sources for quotes and information. Usually this is going to be either members from your community or other organizers. You can't write a story as a journalist without having sources quoted in it. And when you can bring the perspective of an organizer, of a community member to a journalist, that really helps enliven it, especially if they're writing a story where they're going to be talking to a lot of like industry or politicians. Those people tend to give kind of like dry quotes or ones that are really overworked, especially when it comes to legislators. And so being able to provide a source who has like a fresh take, who can really speak to the on the ground experience of people who are dealing directly with issues around zero waste, again, very appealing to journalists. And the last thing is background on issues. So if a journalist is writing a story and something related to your campaign isn't necessarily their typical beat, they're going to need to get up to speed really quickly on the topic. And if you give them the background, right, rather than especially industry or somebody who's in some kind of opposition to your campaign, that'll really help shape the story. And again, establish that kind of trust with journalists that you also get from giving them good sources and good tips. And providing background is basically talking to them on the phone and explaining what's been happening, what they need to understand to be able to write their story in like an interesting, nuanced, and complete way. And I'm actually going to pause here and add something that's not in the slide, which is that when you are talking to journalists, you'll hear the phrase background, and that does mean something specific. And when we get to the media best practices at the end, I'm going to clarify that a little bit. So next up, what do you get from press? You get coverage, most importantly. It's going to bring attention to your campaign and put pressure on officials that are either, maybe not helping, or the opponents like industry. It'll, just elevate what's going on, especially at a local level. Press coverage is really helpful because it, adds that pressure. In a broader perspective, it elevates zero waste as a crucial issue. So it helps kind of demystify things for readers. We're wanting to bring our stories to the forefront so that when people hear about zero waste, they're not just thinking about like, oh, we're not supposed to use plastic straws anymore, right? With good media coverage, we can talk about zero waste being a holistic issue that's related to solving the climate crisis and help people, understand what it's actually about, understand that it exists on the community level, and that it's also something that, even though it's a systemic issue, they can also feel like empowered to get involved with locally. Like I said, turns an abstract concept into real world examples besides like a plastic straw or plastic bag ban, which, while can be a helpful part of telling the story, is not nearly as compelling as talking about a local composting program or waste diversion, the kinds of campaigns that all of you are already working on. And the last thing that we really need as a movement is to combat industry narratives, right? We're very used to journalists kind of repeating myth cycling, wish cycling kind of ideas, or maybe just not fully understanding what zero waste is from a broader perspective. And that's where industry gets to step in and say things like, oh, incineration is a better solution than others, or waste to energy is a viable solution to the climate crisis, and it's a sustainable fuel. Things like that, right? By getting press coverage from our perspective, we can really push back on industry messaging. And this kind of goes a little bit back to the background thing I was talking about in the previous slide. Industry, right, has like such a well-oiled press arm. It's very easy for them to just give buzzwords and kind of greenwashing ideas to journalists. And when we're the ones presenting the background and we're getting coverage of our campaigns, readers, the press, politicians will see that there's actually another side to the story than what the industry is promoting. And so by putting our story out there instead, it really starts to shift the conversation away from what the industry wants. So like I said, I think it's really helpful for organizers to understand how the reporting process works so that they can have reasonable expectations for what happens when they get contacted by press. So it starts with a pitch. Sometimes this is a reporter coming to an editor and saying, oh, I have this idea, or I heard about this thing and I want to cover it. The editor will talk it over with them a little bit and decide to move forward. Or sometimes it's an editor assigning a story to a writer. It really depends, from publication to publication. When it comes to organizing campaigns, usually it's going to be local or regional press covering your campaign. But you might get asked occasionally by a national publication or someone who's writing a long form article. But when it comes to local media, the pitch process is very quick. Usually it's like a couple of days at most. If you send out a press release, for example, that's something where a reporter or an editor might use that as a pitch. So they'll decide like on the angle of the story, who they're going to talk to and when the deadline is, and then move forward from there. So then there's the actual reporting process where the journalist is talking to sources, doing their own research, shaping up the story, sort of finding out what's going on. And as I wanted to note here, the more helpful you are here, the more likely you are to be included. This can sometimes be a difficult balance between, is this story worth my limited time as an organizer, and what could this story get for me or my organization or my campaign? So you'll want to think about that. But in general, the more helpful you are to reporters, the more likely they are to include your perspective in the story, and then also maybe even come back to you in the future for either story ideas or to talk about another story that they're working on in sort of a related field. And so even if you can't give them a lot of time, think about how you can make their job easier, right? Like give them a written quote, even if you don't have time to give them an interview, refer them to another organization, give them some helpful background information, make their job as easy as possible. And that starts to kind of establish that positive relationship. So the editing process, right, is once the journalist is done reporting, they'll file the story to their editor. It'll go back through anywhere from one round to many, many rounds of edits. This process, if it's like a breaking news story about something that's changing quickly, it'll take like a day, maybe two. If it's something a little bit longer lead, it could take a few days to a week. If you are working with a journalist on a story who's writing something for a print magazine, which is a little bit more exceptional of a case, but still might be something that you're running into, it can take months for a story to come out. I had a story for a print magazine where I was covering an activist, and it took a year and a half to go from my pitch being accepted to the story actually being published. So when it comes to being contacted for like a big feature, it's good to talk with the journalist about what their timeline is, and also really set your expectations that it might take a really long time. And then this applies to any story. There's also a possibility that the story could get canceled, or in the parlance of the industry, killed. Sometimes that happens because the situation around the story changes really rapidly and the story is out of date. Sometimes it happens because the priorities of the publication have shifted, or the editor that the journalist was working with left the publication. Or sometimes, again, in the case of like longer lead print features, they can just kind of disappear into the ether. So don't expect that the story isn't going to move forward, but definitely stay in communication with the journalist with the knowledge that sometimes it can take a while. And then the story gets published. Yay, that's great. Like I said, like bother the reporter until this happens, or they tell you, hey, actually, we're not moving forward with it. And then once it comes out, occasionally there will be follow-up coverage where they kind of tease out an additional angle of the story, or there's an update to the story. And then again, if you've established that good relationship with them, they'll probably come back to you for that follow-up coverage, or you can even suggest it to them. That's a really good thing to do if the story reporting process went well. When you have an update, bring it to the journalist. Again, you bring them a story, that makes their job easier because that's one less idea they have to come up with to give to their editor. So a really important thing for organizers to understand is what even gets a pitch approved or catches an editor's eye. This is newsworthiness, right? Like what makes a good story from a journalistic perspective. There's a couple of different categories. Timeliness, it connects to like an urgent issue or topic. I would say that for the zero waste movement, the first 4 of these are the ones that are most relevant to our work. Our stories are really timely, right? Like there's no bigger story right now than the climate crisis. And if we can continually connect our work to that story, and it's a topic, right, that does have a lot of sort of like reader fatigue, people feel overwhelmed by it, they feel anxious about it, they feel sad about it. If we can bring zero waste forward as not just a new angle, but also sometimes a very like invigorating and hopeful one, that's a really good one. Which brings us to the next newsworthiness thing, right? It's relevant, which means that it matters to a publication's audience. And this takes a couple of different forms. If it's a really big, like national publication, something like the climate crisis, right? That's relevant to everybody. But if it's a local publication, you can go a lot deeper, right? So a national publication, like, isn't going to really, to be frank, like care that you had like a town hall meeting or even organized a protest or you got a permit approved or something, right? But if you're talking to a local journalist, it's going to be a lot more relevant to their audience. Another form of relevance is if the publication covers like a really specific topic, like, you know, waste management or organics or something like that. There's a relevance there where it'll also shape how you tell the story, right? Like with a publication that has like a niche, you'll be able to go into more detail because their readers are going to understand that. And it also offers an opportunity if you have a moment in your organizing that would only be interesting to a niche publication or to, you know, something really specific, then you can, you know, bring that idea to that publication and get coverage that way, even though something really specific might not be interesting to like a general audience. It's important. It impacts a lot of people or has high stakes. Again, this kind of varies in terms of the scale and the locality and the coverage, the sort of like coverage area of the publication. What qualifies as many people? It could be everyone in a town. It could be everyone in a state. It could be everyone in the world. But you know, that's another aspect of newsworthiness. But I think the one that we as a movement probably can dig into the most is human interest, right? Like we have so many stories that are really fascinating and riveting that get into people's personal experiences, into histories of communities, into, you know, really fascinating or scary topics that all have a really, really deep human impact. And this is something that we can really bring to the press as something appealing that readers are going to want to find out about. I know I keep coming back to this, but humanizing, localizing, scaling down the climate crisis and presenting zero waste as a key solution to that crisis is something that we really offer to the press. And humanizing that story is the way that it is the most appealing, I think, from a personal level. Other elements of newsworthiness that you'll probably run into a little bit less often, but still could be relevant to your work. Controversial things, right? When it comes to zero waste, this could be something about a new project being built, or anything that has like a lot of conflict in it, right? Maybe there's a local election that hinges on some sort of initiative that you're involved with, or could be swayed one way or another, depending on where the candidates stand on a relevant issue. It's sensational, shocking, or scandalous. This is usually like political scandals or things like that. But again, are you working around an organization or an environmental justice issue or a piece of infrastructure that is uniquely bad or causing really severe problems that would shock people? We want to be really careful here not to sensationalize like tragedy and suffering and the real impacts of the climate crisis and of pollution and burning and burying on our communities. But sometimes a little bit of that, right, can really bring to the fore for readers just how horrible our current system is. It's prominent. The parties involved have a public profile. This is really just, for the most part, going to be about elected officials and would most likely be for like a local publication where readers are really going to care about hearing like, oh, how is like a local official involved in this issue? And the last one is novelty, which is just not something you read about every day. A particularly interesting success in a campaign or, a way that you're going about organizing that's kind of unusual. Just think about that phrase. It's not something you read about every day. That could guide you. But when it comes to newsworthiness, to again be really, really frank, a thing to keep in mind as an organizer is that the press just doesn't care about your work nearly as much as you do. You could think that a step in your campaign deserves like a front page above the fold splash, like, you finally achieved some step that was really crucial to you. You got someone on board, you got a piece of land or a piece of equipment, whatever it is in your organizing campaign that's really exciting to you. When you think about it from a journalist's perspective, it's probably going to be about 10 notches less interesting to them, because not only are they really busy, they also have to come at it from this, objective perspective, where even if maybe personally they think the work that you're doing is really exciting, they can't cover everything that you do, again, unless they're like a really small local publication, and they have to cover it from a perspective where they're talking to multiple people. And just because it's exciting to you, it doesn't mean that it's exciting to them. And so the reason I bring this up is not to discourage you, but to really push the fact that the more newsworthy you can present your campaign as being, the more likely it is to catch a journalist's eye and get the coverage that you want. So as you're thinking about how to talk about your story to the press, run through these things in your head. Is this thing that we're working on really timely to our local or regional media? Is it really relevant to the topic, to the publication that's approached me? Or what are some publications to which it is incredibly relevant? What's important about it? And like I said, what's a human element that I can bring to this to stop it from being a really abstract topic and make it something that readers can really connect with? So yeah, just like run through those things in your head as you're thinking about how to tell your story to the media. Oh, hold on. So a good thing to do also when you are talking to the media is to develop your angle and how you're going to present your story to them. So be prepared about it. Think about what you want to say and practice saying it. In this room, this digital session, there's probably a wide variation in terms of people's comfort talking to journalists. So if this is fairly new to you, like run a mock interview with another organizer. You can ask them to be antagonistic or to be sympathetic, have them ask follow-up questions so that you know what you might want to talk about in advance, and just get comfortable saying things in a way that makes sense to you when you're talking to somebody else. So we talk about talking through the media. That means you're thinking about like, who is your audience in talking to this journalist, and what is their audience that you can communicate to? Are you trying to reach legislators, other community members, or even opponents to your campaign? With each of those audiences, you're going to frame things a little bit differently. And maybe the answer is you want to just get it out to anybody that you can. But if it's a story that's focused on one of these things, right, a piece of legislation that's in office, getting local community members or maybe business owners on board with your campaign, or fighting really directly against an opponent, you can phrase things in different ways that are going to get the attention of those different audiences. And then, you think about how you're framing the story, right? Like, is this about zero waste in general? Is it about anti-incineration? Is it about organics? How can you tie what you're doing to a larger framework, which increases the potential relevance of your story and also helps journalists and their editors and their audiences think about individual actions or community level actions in a bigger way. So when you're giving those quotes about your own experience, always look for ways to tie it into a larger issue, which keeps it fresh, keeps it relevant, and encourages people to like learn more about the topic. And you'll also want to, again, going back to like, what do we want from the press, right? One of the things is an opportunity to combat industry narratives. So we call out greenwashing and false solutions, talk about terms that, especially if the journalist uses them in your interview that are really just industry terminology, point out to them like, hey, actually, when we say chemical recycling, for example, that's something that the plastics industry is promoting, and it's actually just burning plastic. Break it down for them and see it as an opportunity to really cut through that kind of messaging, and come into the interview prepared, right? Like, is this a journalist who's covered this topic before? Are they going to need me to give a little bit more background and context? Think about that kind of a thing. So, best practices for talking to journalists. When you get a press request from somebody who you don't recognize, an important thing to do is to do a little bit of research on them. Who are they writing for? What have they covered in the past? For local campaigns, usually this is just to kind of like get a feel for who the journalist is. Like I said in the last slide, are they going to need a lot more background than other reporters you might have talked to? If you're part of a larger organization or part of an organizing drive that's receiving a lot of like more widespread media attention, or it's in a location that has a lot more intense opposition, you may also need to actually do some real vetting and just make sure that this person is legitimate. That could be, the issue there could be that you're talking to somebody who is actually trying to do like opposition research, right? And learn about your campaign so that they can take it back. Rarely in our space, but happens more with other issues, but could start happening more as climate becomes a bigger and bigger topic. You can also get essentially like far right phishing requests from organizations like Project Veritas, where they try to interview organizers and then like entrap them and edit videos into a deceptive like format. Like I said, this is much less likely to be happening to any of us right now. But again, the more prominent your organization is, the more you need to do vetting. Although if you're part of a big organization, they probably, have more of a media arm and can help you with this. So, but no matter who you are, like approach it with a little bit of skepticism, or just to get to know the reporter so that you can be really well prepared for the interview. So the next thing to remember to do is frame first and answer second, especially with reporters who are new to the space or sometimes really, really deeply embedded in it. You want to present your framing of the story before answering their question, especially if the question is really straightforward. Because if you don't do this, what can happen is that the journalist will just print a really short quote from you that answers their question, and you lose the opportunity to frame the story or even get your framing, which illuminates the issue further, actually into the story. So you want to just like talk a little bit about the context and the larger framing, even if the journalist didn't ask you that. Come prepared with those ideas so that you can kind of guide the story and then answer their question, rather than just making it really easy for them to only write the story the way that they're thinking about it going into it. Whereas if you frame it first, then sometimes you can help them frame the story in a helpful way for you. Kind of related to what I said earlier about how journalists like just care less about your issue than you do. You want to avoid jargon, especially when it comes to more mainstream publications or like niche publications for different industries or audiences. They don't want to print kind of like social justice-y language for the most part. And they don't always know what buzzwords or catchphrases mean, right? Like be specific. Think about how you would tell the story to somebody who has no idea what your work is, who has never heard of anything that you're involved with. Like, think about the journalist that way, right? You want to give them quotes that are going to resonate with a large audience and that don't have buzzwords, don't have jargon, and don't sound like they're coming from necessarily an organizing perspective, right? You want to talk as just kind of like a typical person who can communicate things in a really clear way. And that'll also, again, make it more likely that a journalist is going to use your quote, because editors, I can tell you, are very, very allergic to like social justice-y language, especially when they're not at like an already left-leaning publication. So just, think about how you'd phrase it in a really simple way and go with that rather than the way that you might talk about an issue internally in your organization, because that is very different than what might translate well to an outside audience. And the last thing is don't waste time, right? That's your time. Assess the opportunity for whether it's a good use of your capacity. This kind of goes back to what I was talking about around background. if you don't have time to actually answer a press request, send the journalist to someone else, send them some information, and be helpful even if you can't answer the question. And be honest with yourself also about whether the scope of the publication, the audience of the publication is actually like a good use of your time. And if it is, go for it. If it's not, don't go for it. I had said earlier that there was one more thing about background. When you're talking with journalists, be really clear with them when they say that they're looking for something on background, on the record, or off the record. Some journalists have different definitions for these terms. On the record means that everything you say could be quoted directly. On background means that any information that you give to the journalist might be used, but it wouldn't be attributed directly to you. And off the record means that nothing that happens in the interview is something that they can use for the story. And if you at any point are thinking about using something that is a little bit sensitive, just make sure and establish really, really clearly before you start the interview what the journalist means by, you can ask them, is this on the record? Is this on background, or is this off the record? And you can clarify with them what they mean by that before proceeding. So that's it from me. Thank you so much for joining us. This is our website. Here's our social media. And if you ever have any questions about dealing with press, I would love to talk to you. My email is right here. Feel free to contact me. I'm always up to help individual organizers and organizations figure out how to talk to the media, because I think we have a lot of stories to share and I would love to help get them out there. So I'm going to stop sharing.
Zoe, this was so informative, and I'm going to move along to Shilpi. Really quick transition here, but we're running a bit behind. And Shilpi has a great presentation now, focusing a little bit more broadly on crafting compelling narratives out of your campaign. So it's not just this is what we want and this is the problem, making it something that actually is powerful and sticks in the minds of the people that you're organizing with. So yeah, take it away, Shilpi. And I guess I will share screen for you.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Adi and the GAIA team for having me. My name is Shilpi Chhotray. I just launched a new BIPOC storytelling collective called People Over Plastic. So feel free to check that out. Before that, I was the global communications lead for Break Free from Plastic for about 5 years. So yeah, People Over Plastic is like a sister platform to our wonderful movement. And we're here today to talk about telling your story. I already learned so much from Zoe, so I'm bummed I missed that bit of her presentation, but we're gonna kind of zoom out. So earned media definitely is a crucial piece of getting our story out in the real world when we're talking about campaigns. Next slide, Adi. I love to start with this kind of narrative arc that whose stories are told, who tells them, and who hears them are critically important. So the number of times, we hear something, there's a repetition, it's going to stick longer and much stronger. So it's really important also when we talk about earned media. And I'm going to give a couple examples. We can just blow through these, Adi, on how the same topic is framed in media. So with plastics and COVID, in one publication, Bloomberg is calling plastics the hero of coronavirus. In the New York Times, the one to the right, this is talking about how the industry in the face of COVID is actually posing one more deadly risk. This was focused on Yvette Arellano, who's a campaigner in Houston, Texas against the petrochemical industries. So we kept seeing the industry putting this message out there that plastics was saving the day and we needed a counter with a strong enough story for that message to be debunked. Next one, please. I think we all know about FORMOSA plastic. They're this massive plastics complex coming into Cancer Alley, Louisiana. On the left, it's called the Sunshine Project. Ironically, we know that it's not all sun and rainbows. This is a death sentence for the people that's living there. So we came out with a op-ed in Truth Out, focused on Sharon Levine's story, kind of sounding the alarm that if we're not careful, the entire United States can become Cancer Alley. And I think I have one more example. This is very common in global publications. Asia's to blame. stem from the Jenna Jemback report that listed the countries most responsible for the plastic pollution ending up in the oceans and coasts, but it wasn't talking about where this shit is coming from in the first place. So, Break Free, GAIA, we've all worked really hard to craft that message to shift the narrative to industry polluters, not consumers, not countries, certainly not our friends in Asia. Next slide. I love to use values-based messaging. I heard Zoe talk about humanizing. She's absolutely right. We have to humanize and avoid jargon and facts as much as possible, unless they're really like outstanding, jarring facts that will aid in the narrative, but that shouldn't be the one kind of leading and hooking the story. So opportunity agenda, this is the link here. Break Free from Plastic Communications Hub uses this for all of our campaigns. It's value, problem, solution, action. So we're really leading with the humanizing and the values-driven approach. And they have some great resources on their website. We actually went through a training with them on crafting narrative. So I'm going to pull some of the main elements of that, starting with values. So we want to introduce people to a new way of thinking about an issue often. What does it mean to be a zero waste campaigner, to develop zero waste cities, zero waste infrastructure? We have to be very careful because industry is now poaching our terms of zero waste. Is zero waste becoming the new sustainability? It's like meaning everything and anything. So very, very important to carefully consider the structure of our messages and particularly how we're leading, how it's beginning. So starting with shared values helps the audiences to really hear the message more effectively than dry facts or rhetoric. I've dropped in examples of how to craft this in the lens of zero waste. So an example of a value could be scaling zero waste cities is critical if we want to prioritize healthy communities as a value in economic security. Next slide, please. So then we go into the problem. And we want to frame these problems as a threat to our vision and values. And this is the place where you can pull out stories and some very compelling statistics that are likely to resonate with the target audience. A statistic we often use is that the global recycling rate is only 9%. There will be more plastic than fish in the ocean by 2050. These things that are sort of going to make someone think twice, but we don't want to drown the story or the narrative with data. When possible, include the root cause of the problem as well as who is responsible for fixing it. So actually naming that villain right up front when you're thinking about story arcs. So an example for the zero waste cities narrative could be, but the broken recycling system enables wealthier nations to outsource their waste problem to other countries. Without scalable zero waste systems, municipalities around the world are under threat. So that could be an idea of a problem. And again, we want to choose the facts carefully. We all have a lot of evidence to support claims. But facts tend to not change minds if they're not couched in values. So present one or two pieces of evidence that can make your case, but make the facts really manageable in terms of how you're communicating it. Graphics that can incorporate facts that are still humanizing are always great. And then stories that people can digest. Finally, we've got solution and then action. So solution, we want to pivot quickly to solutions. There's so much doom and gloom. So we're stating the problem. How can we get to the solution? Really putting narratives out there without a solution is sort of a no. We want to have a way to fix this or feel like we can fix it, name the people that are involved that can fix it, and then have an action. So for solutions, positive solutions are going to leave people with choices, ideas, and motivation. We definitely want to assign responsibility. Think about your favorite Disney book, right? We've got the villain, we've got the hero, and there is some sort of light at the end of the tunnel. So who can enact this solution? Is it government? Is it corporations? Those are usually who we're playing with in our world. Make sure your solutions fits the problem that you've posed. For our example in zero waste cities, we can say, fortunately, prioritizing plastic reduction in zero waste systems can provide up to 200 times as many jobs as disposal, furthers environmental justice, and gets at the root cause of the problem. So here I couched in a little bit of a number. I think even there, maybe it was a little bit too wonky. So you kind of have to see what's going to work. Action is the next slide. So we're going to go to value, problem, solution, action. You're going to assign an action. What can this specific target audience do? And we didn't have enough time to get into understanding your target audience, but making sure whoever you're communicating to is equipped to do that action, right? If it's a group of fifth graders, we're not going to tell them to make calls to their senators. So we have to know who the target audience is we're working with. Give them something concrete that they can picture themselves doing. Is it making a phone call? Is it signing a petition? Is it to share a social media toolkit with their network? Steer clear of vague messaging like learn more. That's not really a call to action. We want something tangible and if possible, metrics oriented. So here an example would be call your representatives, your senators, tell them that this country needs to invest in zero waste cities by banning non-recyclable plastic, right? So you can kind of play with the different language here. Next slide, please. So just to pull out, because I really want to get to this breakout group. Again, the value, the problem, solution, the action. This is the whole list of kind of where we started to where we end up with the action and the takeaway. And so I do want to move to the breakout group, and we'll try to keep this to 10 minutes instead of 15. And we have four breakout groups. So the three facilitators will be myself, Zoe, Monica, and Adi. And for my lovely facilitators, you can see in the notes section what we're going to do. So I really wanted to ground what it takes to actually write a narrative or have the story live in the real world. So I want you to take a few minutes. We're not going to do 5 minutes, but a few minutes to write the most important campaigns that you have going on right now on the blue stickies. And then we're going to come back in your breakout groups and put stickers. There's little star stickers on the campaigns that are most compelling to you. And then we're going to take a few minutes to write down what comms or storytelling needs are required to make these narratives and campaigns a success in the real world from a communications perspective and a storytelling perspective on the pink stickies. So then we'll come back, and if we have time for reflection, we'll do that. But I find this exercise to be really grounded in terms of what we're prioritizing for storytelling and what's needed to accomplish it. So facilitators, any questions on that? And then Adi, you can break us up into 4 groups.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Shilpi. Should I drop the link to the slides in the chat for people?
Yes. So everyone will need to be able to access the presentation to interact with it. And depending on your group, it's listed at the top. So there's 1, 2, 3, and 4.
Cool. And Jenny will go ahead and break us out into groups for the last 10 minutes or so, and then we'll all come back together to close out.